I love listening to the Tim Ferriss podcast, but sometimes I listen to guys that really act like they have a lot of wisdom to offer, but really fail to acknowledge that to a large extent they just got really damn lucky. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So sometimes life is just a matter of, throwing dog shit at the screen door and hoping something lands on the other side,
Welcome to Corporate Warrior, the podcast that brings you the best advice on how to improve your health, optimize performance, and maximize productivity. With your host, Lawrence Neal.
Hi guys, I am Lawrence Neal and welcome to another episode of Corporate Warrior, the podcast that teaches you how to optimize your health, exercise, business, and lifestyle. My former guests include paleo pioneers Mark Sisson and Rob Wolf, zero carb carnivore Dr. Sean Baker, high intensity strength training experts like Drew Bay and Skylar Tanner, successful entrepreneurs, creatives, time management experts, extreme endurance adventure racers, and everything in between. You're going to absolutely love this episode. It's always such a treat to talk to this man and learn about his latest perspectives on the world. Before we started recording, I even said I wish I grew up and lived in his town so I could learn from him as my life mentor and fast track my own learning. Returning to Corporate Warrior is the man that made it all possible, Dr. Doug McGuff. Many of you probably have a Dr. Doug McGuff shrine in your bedroom, so he probably needs no introduction. I'm thinking of a cartoon called Hey Arnold, where the girl cartoon character in the series has a shrine made up of Arnold with her bubblegum over the years. So not sure if that's a reference that many of you will understand, but just Google Hey Arnold shrine and something will probably come up. But if you're not one of those people and you don't know much about Doug, Doug is an ER physician and co-author of Body by Science and the Primal Prescription Surviving the Sick Care Sinkhole, among a number of other titles. To echo Anthony Johnson from the 21 Convention, Doug is one of the wisest men of our time and sadly very underappreciated in the health and fitness field. Doug has had the single biggest impact on my own health and fitness journey. We talk about Doug's current projects, training frequency in the context of the tool you were using to exercise, how to interpret and implement exercise science, neck training, the zero carb diet, relationships with women, and much, much more. I'm so excited to finally publish this and for you to listen to it. For all of the show notes and links for this episode and all episodes, please go to the usual place, which is corporatewarrior.org. Don't forget to hang around at the end for your free gift from me. And now I give you the one, the only, Dr. Doug McGuff. Doug, welcome back to Corporate Warrior. It's an honor to have you back on the show as always.
Lawrence, it's great to finally be back. Thanks for having me.
Really pleased we finally got to schedule this. You've been incredibly busy with work in the ER and I'm sure running Ultimate Exercise and somewhat trying to create a social life and all of that. So I appreciate how busy you are. Long while ago when we last spoke, you talked about the kind of goal to ramp down work in the ER so you could focus more on Ultimate Exercise and or writing more books. I think you were going to write a book on myokines. I'm not sure if that's in production. Is that still the goal? Has that doesn't look like from where I'm standing that's really happened in terms of ramping down the work in the ER?
That's the goal, and it's always been a goal. But it's an odd thing in emergency medicine, and for all the optimizers that listen to this podcast, it's embarrassing to say, "Yeah, God, I'm so busy and it's all messed up." But you have to understand there's different kinds of busy, and there's busy of when you select a profession, when you select one that presents to you what has to be dealt with, and then that's what you got to deal with in terms of scheduling and just the emergentness of it and unpredictability of it. You kind of get conditioned to just reacting to whatever the environment presents to you and consuming what's ever put in front of you. And it makes it harder to break away. And right now, particularly in the United States, emergency medicine in particular is just, for lack of a better word, it's such a horrible shit show that, it's not just you at stake, it's you and your partners, your comrades that help you cover the ER, because it's a 24/7 operation. And it's sort of like being on the beaches of Normandy and talking about how you would like to ramp down. It's just like if you do, you're leaving someone in the lurch, and it's very tricky to do. But that still is the ultimate goal, is to try to ramp up, the consultation business, ramp up ultimate exercise even better than it is right now. And then to whatever extent I can ramp that up, ramp that down on the emergency medicine side. And believe it or not, the personal training business and the consultation have actually allowed me to do that to a significant extent. I'm probably working 25% less shifts, 30% less shifts than I would normally have to based on that. But I would certainly like to improve that ratio even further.
So it sounds like it's more of a sense of responsibility and not leaving other people in the lurch, as you said there, versus financial gain.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's the financial gap is not as big as it used to be. Part of it was like you had one foot on the boat and one foot on the dock, and it was sort of, you had to get the two a little closer together before you could jump. Now it's close enough together where you could jump, but there still is the issue that on the emergency medicine side of things, it's absolutely dependable. Whereas the other side of things, as you've experienced as an entrepreneur, is kind of feast or famine. And a lot of times you really don't have control over when is feast and when is famine. And sometimes it doesn't time itself well. So that creates a little bit of hesitation.
Yeah, it's been a strange experience going from working in the corporate grind in London to becoming an entrepreneur and living in Ireland. A massive shift in change in lifestyle in both directions, in terms of, moving away from a city to a rural area, but also, going from full-time employed work to being my own boss.
Having a foot in both worlds, when I imagine doing what you did, I imagine there must be an incredible amount of angst during downtime, because you feel like, I could be doing something to kind of grind and make this build, and it's like hard to turn it off and just say, okay, now's the time when I relax. You nailed it. It's a real fun to try to achieve that.
I think, because you can obviously relate to that. I think any kind of person who's ambitious or a high achiever has that issue. And, we try and, we live in a beautiful place now. We're literally 30 minutes away from the sea, and there's a wonderful walk you can do along the sea and here in Galway. And, we try and schedule time every Sunday, 2 to 3 hours to go and do that, me and my partner. And I'm doing it, and I'm still got, a sense of obligation in my head to get back to work. It's really hard to relax. I'm getting better at it, and I'm seeing how actually when you do have downtime and you do relax, how actually that can foster a lot of good ideas, and make you more productive in the long term. So,
yeah, one of my favorite podcasts ever that I've listened to over and over again on Tim Ferriss's podcast is the one with Josh Waitzkin. And if you can listen to that just multiple times, he talks about cultivating empty space, and that empty space is kind of an absolute necessity for where creativity happens and where really productive work springs from those empty spaces, and you have to cultivate it. He's a guy that he does zero social media and just really is pretty reclusive, but is at the same time very productive and very sought after, which is an odd combination as opposed to someone that's constantly tweaking their social media and trying to goose things along. He has a very different approach that I find, what he's got to say is very useful.
I completely agree. And I have listened to that once, but I could definitely do with re-listening to it. And I do try and emulate that type of behavior. I've never been one to be too interested in being all over social media. I never found it to be that effective. Obviously, that's very subjective, but I really try and emulate that, and I struggle, but working on it. So what are you working on currently? What's been going on lately for you in terms of what's taking up most of your time?
Well, what's taking up most of the time is just emergency medicine and the rotating schedule still. The system here is breaking down in such a way that the ER is just continuously overrun and overcrowded. So you really, in terms of that, have to be very vigilant about managing your recovery for the other aspects of life. I do want to write the myokine book. I've started an introduction. I've got an outline. It's just a matter of breaking away enough time. It's almost like a paragraph or page a day kind of project. But that's how it goes. That's how it gets done. I mean, when you look at the difference between, people that actually complete a project or accomplish things or do things that you want to do in life and the people that don't, their lives are pretty much the same except for maybe 10 or 15% that's different. And it's just that 10 or 15% that they spend, kind of sitting down and grinding on something rather than, watching Game of Thrones on TV or something different like that, So I'm trying to be that guy, which is sometimes hard.
I love that because I think most people believe that, high achievers or anyone that creates something worth talking about has a completely different template to their day, has this crazy self-discipline and, structures every minute to doing something productive. But yeah, I absolutely agree with you. The reality is they're probably just focusing on maybe one or two effective tasks every day and then doing it in piecemeal,
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get into resistance training. Got a few questions on that, as you probably expected. So I've had quite a lot of conversations with guests with regard to progression and to be more specific, how to manage frequency and recovery and volume. You did some great stuff on YouTube recently, answering some of the, I guess, debate which has been happening on my podcast, which is really helpful. I just wanted to rattle through a few questions just to get your opinion and help reconcile this for me as much as those listening. So I did an episode recently with Dr. Ted Naiman, and we've actually done 2 episodes. I'm not sure if you managed to listen to those. And Ted's interesting because he's been experimenting with training daily. So a single set to failure, full body weight routine on a daily basis. Now, based on what I understand from your perspective, you're really going, most people, if they follow that type of approach to training, are going to overtrain. Now, am I right in that assumption? How do you think about that? And what do you think about Ted's approach to training?
Yeah. So the answer is not necessarily. You're not necessarily right in that assumption. There are a lot of different ways to skin the cat, and you're always, if you think of a sound technician in a studio with slide bars, and you got slide bars for volume, intensity, frequency, and there's a happy combination between those 3, but there's an infinite number of combinations between those 3 where you can make it work. And my understanding from listening to Ted is that when he's working out every day, it's actually a very abbreviated workout focused on one body part that rotates. And I think if you're doing that almost every day, but it's a really short workout that's small volume and you're just kind of moving about the body, that you can stimulate an adaptation within the constraints of recovery and make that work. I vary between, what I found with my work schedule is that the likelihood of me making it works best if I'm going every 4th or 5th day. So I can do a full body routine, but then before just even 2 or 3 workouts, I have to do it into a 2-way split. And then after 5 or 6 workouts of that, if I'm going to maintain that frequency, then I go into a 3-way split, just to manage the recovery at that fixed frequency, because my work schedule is such that I can work out at that frequency. If I try to do it every seventh day, it just, for whatever reason, does not work. So I found that I'm kind of painted into a corner on what my frequency is going to be. So I manage my volume intensity to backfit that. If I wanted to, I could backfit my volume and frequency to do something every day and still make it work. It's having learned to read your own signals about what recovery is. You could make that work. I could make that work. You, Lawrence, could make that work, or anyone could. But whether that's what's going to fit best into your lifestyle or fit your personality best is in question. Body by Science is built on the premise that if you look, kind of broadly across the population and you want to cover the whole body in a workout, you're going to look at somewhere between 5 and 7 days of recovery. But that's just one paradigm for how to move those slide bars around. It's just a gateway drug, for lack of a better term, into getting someone into, the time-efficient workout you can do the rest of your life. It's going to have huge health and performance implications.
Interesting. I mean, where I need to challenge you a little bit on that, or at least have a follow-up question, is, with the perspective to Ted's, I mean, I appreciate Ted is one person. It's N equals 1. It's not going to apply to everyone. But you say he does abbreviated workouts. I mean, they are relatively short, I suppose, but they're still, 5 to 7 movements performed to failure, in muscular failure, in a bodyweight fashion. So push-ups, chin-ups, single-legged squats, that type of thing. Now, done daily, that still seems like a far cry away from training every 4 or 5 days, because it's comparable to a big 5 in a lot of ways. So do you feel like, can you kind of elaborate? Because I'm still struggling to understand how that can work how that can be effective for someone, even though on one hand you're saying, well, you need more recovery from these other workouts.
Right. So first, I guess I got to qualify that, I'm not really deeply attuned to what he's doing. I've never experienced what his sets are like, but I can say that the level of intensity, even if the difference of 2.5% intensity at the upper end of that curve makes huge implications for recovery intervals. So, if you're doing body weight exercises, you're doing 5 to 7 movements, you're going to fatigue and all that, I think the implications for recovery are probably different than if you're all on Renex equipment, doing 5 or 6 movements, going failure and deep inroad on something like that. There's probably some musculo-mechanical things that are stopping you from a depth of fatigue that's going to preclude that level of frequency, interfering with recovery. But, the thing is, we ask all these questions and it's like, how can that be? I have to challenge you on that. But your answer is, look at Ted. Unless he's lying, it works. And I don't think he's lying. So there are many different ways to skin the cat, but everything involves some trade-offs.
That's really interesting, because even Ted would admit that, he's never touched a barbell. So, so I think, that's something I overlooked, was the efficiency, effectiveness of a high quality machine.
Yeah. And there's, clearly one of the major stimuli for an adaptation is just achieving a meaningful level or depth of fatigue. And you can do that with no equipment whatsoever, as you've experienced, as Project Kratos has demonstrated, and how to progress and things of that nature. But still, there's no getting around that the stimulus is multifactorial. And one of those factors is the load and the damage that it brings about. And that has some powerful effects on the stimulus, but it also has some powerfully, I wouldn't say negative, but it has some significant impact on what the recovery interval is going to be. So I think that probably fits into that equation somewhat. But I think the point of the videos that I put up on YouTube is to kind of get people to think a little bit more creatively about this being a very broad spectrum, not only for the given individual. For an individual, there are many different ways that you can manipulate volume, frequency, and recovery that would still work for you. When something would come out of the black box that still works. But then throw into that the massive variability amongst the population and what a given individual is going to find optimal, both from a physiologic and psychological standpoint, and that I'm happy with whatever someone finds in that combo that works for them and makes it a lifelong practice for them. Because there's just nothing else that you can do short of really attuning your diet. There's nothing else really that you can do that is so valuable. The return on investment for the amount of time spent is so massively wonderful that I just don't want anyone to miss out on it, because what has been told is this is what works best doesn't fit for them.
Yeah, I understand that completely, and highly recommend that people check out your videos on YouTube, and I'll definitely link to those from the show notes. Yeah, I mean, this is really useful. So I just wanted to summarize something we just touched on earlier with regard to the frequency. So is it then fair to say that if one is using, let's say, modified, MedX or Nautilus machines that are highly effective at inroading musculature, that then if you were to train daily on something like that, then the chances are you will actually overtrain and it will be too much to recover from?
Yeah, if you were covering, a significant chunk of the body, or using movements that were similar or the same movement on a day-by-day basis, I don't think you would be able to do it. I mean, even in the early Nautilus days with the osteoporosis project, back in those days, high-intensity training was Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or 3-day-a-week kind of thing, and they applied a super slow routine, to the subjects then 3 days per week, and everyone was just chronically ragged out. But that's not to say that if you subdivided it to single body part that you could make it work. Although, the double-edged sword with optimal equipment and optimal instruction is you're ramping up, the intensity on, the inroad and the metabolic effect and all those other elements. And as you ramp those up, your margin of error for recovery interval gets tighter and tighter. So sometimes optimizing on the stimulus side of the equation makes things very precarious on the recovery side of the equation, and that's just a trade-off.
I want to touch on this concept of progressive overload. It gets thrown around a lot in resistance training, and it's just something that I've been bringing this up in a fair number of the last few interviews I've done. And I remember, James Steele saying that, there doesn't really seem to be much evidence to support that you need to increase resistance, as you get stronger and as you progress in your workouts in order to stimulate optimal gains. Even though obviously it makes things a little bit more efficient, because you're squeezing that time under load to make it a bit more manageable and reducing the suffering, I suppose. And I just wondered, in the context of like body weight training, where, it's more difficult to increase resistance, where you have to, for instance, in Project Kratos, Drew Bay shows you how to make the exercises more difficult, in order to help you to progress. But I just wondered, how effective is that of optimizing gains versus just training to momentary muscular failure every time? Because, in a chin-up, as you talked about before, you can hit failure within, say, a 60 to 70 second window forever. And that just becomes like the time that your body just hits failure for whatever reason. So is that not going to reach the same end goal just by using that approach? How do you think about that? And what's your take on that?
Yeah, there's multiple variables going on there, but I guess I would first answer the question by asking you a question, since you've actually done it. You've gone from training on MedX in a Keyser facility to doing a Project Kratos type workout there in Ireland. How much size have you lost?
None. From a lean mass point of view, I don't think. But I haven't gained any either. I would say.
Yeah. But had you stayed at Keyser on the MedX machines, do you think you would have gained any more?
No, I my personal opinion is that I hit my genetic ceiling, and then I remember at Keyser was just flat. I think, yeah.
Okay, so the first thing you got to back up when you're asking that question is say, for most people in the population, what is the rate limiting factor? And when the rate limiting factor is your genetic ceiling, then that makes the answer, it probably doesn't matter. So what the two Jameses have figured out in their research is that really it is recruitment and fatiguing of motor units is what is producing the stimulus. And there's many different ways to get at that. And they don't necessarily require progression of the resistance. I remember Richard Winnett, he had his Ageless Athletes newsletter. A long time ago, a friend of his that had fallen out of weight training, that was genetically gifted, got back into weight training, and he basically had a fixed weight barbell and a fixed weight set of dumbbells in his backyard. And that's all he used to train, the same weight, never progressed it, and the guy just blew right back up to where he was before and looked fantastic with no progression at all, and just, a barbell and some dumbbells in his backyard, literally. And that was the first representation of that. Now, I think, and when Terry Carter, my first instructor at Ultimate Exercise, really kind of figured out the progression issue for us there at the time, he goes, really the reason for progression is just to keep the time under load within a tolerable range that you can stand. And that it's not really necessary for the improvement. The way I think about it is I think early in the game, like when we first take on clients at the facility, or if you want to follow a Mark Ripito type program, the early portion of the program should be linear progression. Our clients, when we first start them out in our shop, the weight's going up every time they show up to train, probably for almost 6 months before they plateau. But the plateau isn't necessarily because of reaching genetic limits or that they're not improving anymore. Eventually you run up against the limitations of the movement as it relates to the musculature. Mm-hmm. So on your chin up, you're always going to kind of bite the dust, after 60 to 90 seconds, depending on who you are, because when you get 90 degrees at the shoulder, 90 degrees at the elbow, and try to get over that hump where the bar is somewhere between nose and eyebrow level, that hard sticking point, when it runs into the dip of your fatigue, those two things running into each other are just going to put a stop to it after a certain amount of time, no matter how strong you get or how much you progress. So I think there is some import to the level of resistance, and that it does provide some mechanical stressor. There is some mechanochemical factor going on that signals protein synthesis. But the point of diminishing returns on that is probably sooner than we think, and I think it's good to progress up to a meaningful level. But I've gotten to the point where on any given movement in my gym or with free weights or anything, I have, a light, moderate, heavy range. If I want the TUL to be short and this to be a heavy experience, or if I really want to focus on form, I know where to put the pin. And I don't worry about progression anymore, because at this level, that's too extrinsic. You're focusing on incremental extrinsic improvements when really you have enough resistance now where your focus needs to change on intrinsic performance improvements that make this more challenging, and that connects your nervous system to your muscles to your mind more effectively. I hope that answers your question, but there's some of my thoughts about it anyway.
No, it does. It's very helpful. So just going back to your example there of the chin up, which is very interesting, and which, obviously I've experienced that sticking point. And I wondered, what kind of suggestions would you give to someone like me, and people that do meet run into sticking points doing bodyweight training in terms of, making progress and getting past those sticking points?
Yeah, I would say number one is probably not that important, but what I would say is that sometimes inroad is compromised by that. And I think the way that someone that's been training long enough to be frustrated by a sticking point, I think what they're experiencing is that sticking point is interfering with the experience of the depth of inroad that they're seeking. So when you have that experience, one of the things I recommend is to do some work above and below the sticking point. And there's usually, if the sticking point's say halfway or 2/3 of the way, there is something that's above the sticking point that's definitely the hard portion of the movement, and something on the other side of the sticking point that's the easy portion of the movement. So I would say that one thing you can do is you've interviewed Brian Johnston, and he's talked about many different things he does to invoke variation, but one of the best variations is just to not fall victim to that sticking point, but exploit it for your advantage. So you can take that sticking point on the chin, and you can do the upper 1/3 of the movement until fatigue, and then drop down and take maybe a brief 10-second recovery, and then do the bottom 2/3 to fatigue. So you're using that sticking point as a marker for where you're going to work. So you work the top 1/3 of the chin until you fatigue, and then you take the pre-exhaustion from having done that to make the easy portion of the movement feel more challenging, and then work in that range. And then what you've done there is a couple of things. One is you've now taken your depth of fatigue for that area of the body significantly deeper than you would have otherwise. And two is for the same amount of work, you've done more contractions. So work is force times distance. You've covered the same distance, but you've done potentially twice as many contractions. And I think to some extent, one thing that Brian has come up with is that I think contraction volume is part of the stimulus as well. So when you're doing a 90-second super slow workout and you get 4 excursions, you may be sacrificing something for the aggressive loading and deep inroad in the fact that you've lost contraction volume.
Got it.
What J-reps do is that for the same amount of work, you get a higher contraction volume, and I think that is of some benefit. And that's one way to kind of be creative and work around sticking points.
Got it. Okay, so it's about basically increasing the volume of that workout effectively. And this is interesting because sorry, go on.
Not the work. Okay, let's say you're going to do a J-rep halves with a chest press. Mm-hmm. So you can do 8 reps, 8 full reps. And let's say the distance moved is 1 foot. So that's 8 foot-pounds. And let's say you do 10 reps. So you've done 800 foot-pounds of work. But you've done 10 repetitions. Or you can break it into half. You do the hard half first, and you get 10 reps. Then you rest briefly, and then you do the easy half next, and you get 10 reps. You've still done the same amount of work in terms of force times distance. So the workload in terms of total work done is the same, but the volume of contractions is now doubled. The other thing is when you're doing it with a compound movement, you got to realize, especially when you're doing slow cadence, that when you're doing a chin, for instance, part of it you may be using, your pecs and your lats, and the next part of it you may be using more your biceps, traps, rhomboids. But that is activated on 2 extremes of the range of motion. So when you're doing a full rep, one thing's resting while the other thing is working. So you're alternating. Whereas when you do it in J-reps, you stay in that range of motion where, say, just your biceps and your rhomboids are really involved until you fatigue those out, and then you go down, and then you're staying in the range of motion where just 2 other muscle groups are mainly involved. So that also affects what your depth of fatigue for the contributing muscle groups are going to be. So the neat thing about this is, by letting go of that, there's just one best way, and starting to realize there's many different ways to milk different things out of the stimulus that you can exploit, then you're not captive to what your workout situation is going to be. The fact that you moved away from London doesn't have to limit you in any way now that you're in Ireland with no equipment.
I don't think that anyone in Ireland has like Med-X or Nautilus or anything like that.
Yeah.
I could be wrong, but I reckon they would have reached out to me by now. The podcast. Yeah. So watch this space. We had a bit of back and forth on YouTube recently, following I think it was your latest video, and I'm not sure actually if this was in response to my comment, but someone else's. But you talk about how big the placebo effect is, with training, and how if you start a new approach, a new protocol, changing the sliders of frequency, intensity, and volume, like you've mentioned, it's really important to just believe in it. Can you talk to me about why you feel the placebo effect is so important and how that is going to help us get better results potentially?
Well, because I'm a doctor, and one of my attendings once told me something that, because the one thing you got to understand about medicine is show business for ugly people. And it's really true. I mean, you would be amazed to the extent we exploit the placebo effect in medicine. And if you look at studies that are placebo controlled, what you'll see is, depending on the condition, the therapeutic effect of any actual pharmaceutically active substance, 40 to 60% of its therapeutic effect is wrapped up into the placebo effect. So your belief and your intention is extremely powerful, and a lot of times much more powerful than any protocol change that you might be making. And part of the problem of always seeking more knowledge, and you hate to tell people, stop following my YouTube or don't listen to this podcast, but of constantly getting data inputs and advice from people, I'm driving my daughter 45 minutes to school, so I'm always listening to a podcast, but sometimes I just got to turn that shit off because the inputs are creating more self-doubt about the thing that I am currently doing than it is benefiting me with any nuggets of wisdom I might pick up along the way. So it's important when you're trying to pick up these nuggets of wisdom not to pick up chunks of self-doubt also. I mean, if something makes sense to you and you want to test its utility, you have to do so with a sense of, this sounds plausible to me, and I think that, that this is going to work, and exploit the placebo effect to your advantage at every possible turn that you can, because placebo effect has gotten a bad rap because, most people take that to mean, oh, you've just psyched yourself out. And that's not the case at all. Our thoughts and our intentions have powerful effects on what outcomes will be in all realms, not just, physical training realms. So you need to exploit that to your advantage in any way that you can. If you're going to take a supplement, you need to pretend like you're taking a powerful steroid and really believe that. And you will get much more benefit of any marginal benefit that a supplement actually has to offer you if you wrap some placebo effect into the fact that you're going to do this thing.
Are you still doing the BCAAs?
I do. I do that after, after a workout. And that was that reminds me, that was one thing about the feeding window that you guys had talked about. And I think you had made some sort of mention that you thought I had said that I actually deliberately waited a few hours before I did that sort of thing. And I think that may have got conflated a little bit. One thing I wanted to say about that as a correction was The research shows that there's just not this tight window that you have to take it within for it to be useful. The window for enhanced muscle protein synthesis in the presence of branched chain amino acids or things that stimulate protein synthesis is actually significantly wider. So there's no like 30-minute to 1 hour deadline after your workout to get this in, or you're not going to get the effect. You can wait till later. And I generally find it beneficial to wait long enough for the queasiness of a workout to wear off before I dump that into my stomach. And that's all there is to it. But I don't think there's any magic tight feeding window where you got to get it in.
All right, so just to clarify, you don't have BCAAs immediately after the workout, or are you referring to them or the first meal that you have?
Either one. Okay. So BCAAs, it just kind of, sometimes I do, it just depends on how I'm feeling. But if it's a big workout, it has a big Metcon effect. If I've done, big movements and I've wrapped it up with a big leg press and, you're huffing and puffing and you got a little nausea and a little bit of carpet time, yeah, I don't jump up and swill down some branched chain amino acids because I'm just going to stain my carpet if I do that. Depends on the situation.
Cool. Okay, so it is fascinating. So do you understand, in regard to physical training, what is the mechanisms behind the placebo effect? How does that help someone perhaps get better results?
The honest answer is I don't know. Although I think there is a powerful neurobiology to belief. And I think it has evolutionary roots. And I think, for a rational animal to, across the board, across its great majority of living species, to have a religious belief, when we have the cognitive power to reason our way out of that, I think there is some understanding that, belief is kind of hardwired into our brain. But I think belief and confidence and our intention have powerful effects on and I think it's neurobiological. I think if you were going to be self-undermining in anything that you're embarking upon, then the neurobiology of that is going to interfere with, biochemical processes that would produce the desired result. So, I don't know what the mechanism is, but I believe there is a mechanism and that it is a real thing.
Interesting. I never see you do neck training. Do you train your neck, and how do you feel about neck training in general?
Yes, I do train my neck. If you scroll far enough through my Instagram, you'll find some. But the truth is a lot of the Instagram pictures are, set up on a tripod and just kind of go off when they go off. It's really hard to do on neck training, but I got a few on there. The other thing is I hate pictures of myself training my neck because at 5 years old, you look like a tortoise eating lettuce, But yeah, I do train my neck. I tend to train it on the day when I do chest and back. I find that neck flexion wrapped in with a chest press movement, I learned this from Robert Francis, one of the super slow masters, is if you combine neck flexion with some of your chest work, it really amplifies the felt effect of it. And neck extension, I wrap into my back or posterior chain work. And I do that almost every time that I do those body parts. And I do train neck, and I think it's enormously valuable. I see, in my work, you see people in car wrecks all the time. And, you got a 15-pound object sitting on top of a broccoli stalk protected by 7 cervical vertebrae. And, and concussion is such a big deal nowadays. And the number one protection against concussion is the strength of your cervical musculature. Because if you can imagine holding a stalk of broccoli in your hand by the stalk and shaking it inside of a bucket, that's what's happening with your brain. And to the extent that the neck can be stabilized, the amount of, concussive shaking that goes on with the head when you have an impact of any kind is exponentially reduced. It is the most protective thing against concussion.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it, and I know I like that analogy. So, so do you feel like I assume you probably have a 4-way neck machine in your facility? Do you? Yeah, but do you feel like things like time static contraction using like a rolled up yoga mat or manual resistance is also effective? Yeah,
absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Absolutely. And, in some ways, probably even preferable. If you're really good at performing dynamic 4-way neck and your form is really, really perfect, it's a great movement, but it is also a movement that's a little bit fraught with danger. Someone distracts you, you turn your head while you're under load, sneeze, cough, adjust yourself on the seat, try to adjust your feet on the floor while you're in the act. Ken Hutchins has gotten to where he only does time static contraction neck.
Interesting.
Because he's so fearful of, and it's very, very effective. Also, if you're good enough at self-administering manual resistance, sometimes if I know I'm going to be time pinched for a workout down at the facility, I only got a 20-minute gap, I'll do manual resistance neck at home before I even get down there. So, you don't have to have a 4-way neck machine to train your neck, and it's important. And really, especially today, with everyone staring at their freaking cell phone all the time, it's a wonderful protection against text neck. Because so many, particularly young people nowadays, their necks come off the front of their body like a giraffe. They look just absolutely deformed,
Yeah. Yeah, you see a lot of that. It's quite strange to see. That's really quite liberating what you just said about the fact that you train the neck before sometimes. Because I sometimes find it's for myself and for a lot of others, it's quite an especially if you're in a commercial gym. It's kind of quite an embarrassing exercise, I mean, high intensity strength training just generally would seem odd to a lot of people in the gym. So to know that you can train your neck separately and it's not a big deal, like you don't have to wrap it all into one workout and it doesn't matter if there's like a 20-minute gap, then, do that at home and then go to the gym. Or if you're very confident and it doesn't bother you, other people think, then this isn't a problem. But certainly for me, it can be, training my neck using kind of manual resistance when everyone's watching you.
Yeah, every time that I self-administer neck exercise when I'm at Pike or a commercial facility, I'm afraid some kid's going to record me on my cell phone and end up on some Instagram, gym fails or something like that.
Oh my god, that'd be so funny. No, that is very interesting, and I mean, just on what you were talking about there regarding the 4-way neck machine, I agree with you. It's I see what you mean about how if you jerk the neck suddenly under load, that can be dangerous. I also found with the 4-way neck machine, and I was supervised using it. I'm not sure whether those that supervised me with that familiar with the machine as perhaps they should have been, but I sometimes found it quite difficult to get the settings correct so that it felt congruent, And I wonder, do you use the same protocol? Do you still go to failure on the neck? And I always found that very difficult to actually achieve.
On a 4-way neck, you mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it's one that Ken Hutchins custom made off the frame of the old Nautilus 4-way neck. But it has a lot of adjustability in it, and I've kind of found my sweet spot for it. It also has an alligator cam, so you can set the cam timing to be appropriate. One of the most important things when you're doing the neck is to realize that the muscles of neck flexion are all intrinsic to the neck. They attach at your collarbone and they attach along your jaw and under your mandible. And so everything that flexes the neck is intrinsic to the neck. So that means that your torso is held very, very stable, while your neck just rotates down into a position where your chin is tucking on your chest like you're holding a sheet to fold it. So that is a very still torso. Whereas the muscles that extend the neck, the majority of them are extrinsic to the neck. And some of them extend all the way down to your sacrum. So in order to fully contract your neck, when you're doing neck extension, you actually got to put your entire posterior chain into extension, so that at the end of the movement, you're basically acting like you're trying to touch your occiput to your butt. So you're arched all the way through. And, some four-way necks actually have a back brace that preclude that and ignore that, by doing that, you're actually creating a problem of, compressive active insufficiency in the whole extensor chain that's involved in that. So, and the other thing is there's two components to your neck extension. The first is the facet joint sliding. So the first part of the movement is actually just sliding back until you're looking straight up. And then once you're looking straight up, then it's rotation along the atlanto-occipital joint at the top of your cervical spine. So part of the movement is sliding, and then the next part of the movement is rotation. So, it takes some instruction and takes some skill to do it well. Now, of course, lots of people, you have entire football teams lined up on a row of neck machines and one single strength coach yelling at them, and everyone's just kind of, So the odds of you getting hurt on the four-way neck machine are actually really small. Ken and the other people, we probably, us geeks probably blow the actual statistical risk way out of proportion. But that's only done because if you consume those odds, the consequences of tweaking your neck or screwing something up can be fairly big in terms of how long it debilitates you and makes you miserable.
Absolutely.
Low, high consequences kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we got recording, you were talking about some of the limitations in science, and I thought this would be a very good time to bring this up. We've been talking about obviously optimizing strength training and that type of thing, and obviously a lot of people are try and stay ahead and try and review all the latest scientific literature to help inform their programming of their training. Do you want to just talk a little bit about where the limitations are and how we should be thinking about the scientific literature?
Yeah, there's so many different facets to answering this question. One of which is that first, I think we got to understand that a lot of the investigations that's being taken in the literature on training itself, that is, we're actually doing research studies on the act of training, really are trying to use science as a weapon to establish authority of what we like to do. So in all fields, so much of research is what's called advocacy research. You're trying to prove what it is that you like, or what it is that whoever is paying you likes when you do research. And that's just human bias, and it's built into it. And it's not to denigrate anyone that does research. That's just human nature, and it cannot be escaped. So it's no big surprise that Brad Schoenfeld's research is going to find positive results for things that are higher volume and frequency and favor periodization. And it's no big surprise that the two James's research is going to find conclusions that advocate more towards single set to failure, low volume type approaches. So first, there's that. There's the whole thing that so much of research is really just advocacy research. And then there's the problem of that the variables being studied may not be the rate limiting factor. So, we're going to look at 1 sets versus 3 sets and what the outcome differences may be. But what outcome differences occur may have a lot more to do with genetic factors in the research groups that we're completely unaware of. And we may not be detecting differences between 1 and 3 sets. We may be detecting differences in the genetic makeup of the 1 set group versus the 3 set group. And there's no way to control for that currently. And that's one of Ryan Hall's major objections about research. It's like, if they haven't controlled for the genotype, I don't even want to read it. And that's a good reason why. The third thing is that a lot of times the study size doesn't give enough power to answer the question about effect size. So how can I put this? So we want to see the difference between two. Ideally, if we wanted to see if an intervention made a difference, we'd want the effect between the intervention and something else to be fairly far apart. Because then if we have a certain height of the effect of those interventions, the bell curves over those two things would not overlap, and we could say, yes, these two things happen not because of chance. But usually, any differences that we care about are usually spaced quite close together. So those two bell curves are going to have so much overlap that you're not going to be able to say with confidence that any differences that occurred other than by chance. Okay? Mm-hmm. So, and then finally, if you have, 20 or 50 college-age males that you've included in each group of your study, the sample size is too small and may exaggerate the effect size. So it's hard to do without visual help, and I'm going to be putting up a YouTube video that will explain this a little bit better. But let's say that we lay a blanket down, and in the middle of that blanket we put a little stick. So the blanket is the effect that we're measuring, and the stick is the sample size. And let's say what we're measuring is flipping a coin. And we know at the beginning of this experiment that if you flip a coin enough times, you're going to get 50% heads and 50% tails. But let's say we flip the coin 10 times. So we're going to push a stick up a height of 10. And the blanket that's over the stick is going to hump up with a very gradual, broad bell curve. But the truth is still 50%. Okay? But now, instead of 10 flips, we're going to do 100 flips. Now that stick rises up higher, and the shape of that blanket is still a bell curve, but it's actually got a steeper pitch to it. So the margins of error are getting tighter toward the mean. Okay? And then finally, we're going to do it 1,000 times. So we're going to take a stick that goes up 1,000 high and pushes that blanket up, and all of a sudden the bell curve is very steep. So if you have a large sample size, if those two sticks are sitting actually close together, you'll be able to discern the difference. But if you're only doing 10 flips, the overlap's going to be so great that you won't even be able to see it. But more importantly, if the sample size is too small, if I flip a coin only 10 times, I have a real good chance in one group of getting 7 heads in a row, which distorts the bell curve way to the right. And then in my other group, I have a really good chance of potentially getting 7 tails in a row, which distorts the bell curve way to the left. So the effect size appear further apart. So when your sample size is too small and you've discovered a difference, you have therefore exaggerated the effect size. So a lot of studies we do that reach conclusions about 1 set versus 3 set, or failure versus not failure, or intensity extenders versus not, are exaggerating the effect size or the lack of effect because the sample size was too small, and by taking too small of a sample size, you can exaggerate the effect size. But the final biggest thing in all of this is a lot of times in all sorts of realms, economics, medicine, physical training, anything that you have a question about, and this is where Nassim Taleb's work comes in, is that a lot of times we assume things are normally distributed, and they're not. And we apply statistics of normal distribution to try to figure out something that's not normally distributed in any way whatsoever. So I'm not saying that we should never turn to research to try to answer our questions. We should. But when we do it, we also have to acknowledge the intrinsic biases that exist in research and that it may not really answer the question for us.
I think that's fascinating. And I think that's the issue is a lot of us, layman or personal trainers who want to stay ahead and stay, and keep up to date with the research, they're not aware of these biases, and they're not trained scientists. And, I mean, when I first started reading papers, I just had no idea what a lot of the terminology meant. And then over time, I've learned more and more about that. But, what you just said is completely new to me about the effect size. Like, I'd never heard that before. So I feel like it's a very steep learning curve with this type of thing, in terms of just interpreting it.
Yeah, it's tough. And, I'm now into a 25-year career in medicine, and that involves reading a lot of literature, and a lot of literature along the way that's become practice changing that 15 years later is just absolutely disproved as not only not effective, but having been harmful to patients.
Wow.
I mean, back in the earlier days of critical care, you were considered an absolute Cro-Magnon if you did not monitor your patients with a Swan-Ganz catheter. But as recently, and that's a particular type of catheter that measures the hemodynamics inside the body of a critically ill person. But as recently as 10 years ago, it got discovered like the mortality of having that thing in and the complications of the procedure itself were causing greater degrees of mortality just for the urge to gather more data. And then actually showing that sometimes more data actually confounds decision-making. More data is not necessarily better. Sometimes the human decision-making mechanism operates better without so many inputs.
Yeah, it's also, I'm just thinking about this as well, is that, the danger is that you get people who aren't aware of these things, who then parade scientific literature to support a certain point of view.
Right.
And that happens all the time.
Most of us, me and you included, are interested in the scientific literature because we do want to parade it to support our point.
Right, quite.
We have to be open about admitting that, and I can't remember the name of the guy. You had one fella that was he's a researcher that was just very, very open about it, and I was just really I loved his podcast just because he was so open about that fact. Is that science, when we're using it properly, really should be a mechanism at finding the best answer, not as a tool to win a fight with. So. And that's just human nature, and that's how we try to make things. But the other damaging thing about really locking in on research that seems to answer a question but may not really is that, again, it can just undermine your confidence about what you're doing and stop you from doing it.
Yep.
When really what matters so much more than anything is just get in there and freaking do it. I remember, I'll harken back again to another Tim Ferriss podcast when he interviewed Amelia Boone, she's a corporate lawyer for, I think, Google? Apple, yeah. And, she's this champion of all these endurance races, Tough Mudder and that kind of. But as I listened to her, I was just so taken aback about how she really didn't have any big training theories or anything. I mean, it's just like, well, I just go out and do what I do, and that was it.
Eat Pop-Tarts, didn't she, for breakfast?
Yeah. But I mean, it was just so much more a matter of, well, I go out and run until it really freaking hurts, or whatever it was that she just was doing the thing, and sometimes I think, I myself get bogged down in the geek side of the equation so much that you don't want to let it interfere from you just going in and getting it done.
Do you know what? That's one thing I really love about your the way you are, Doug, is you always have a lot of humility about you. And I've heard you on a number of cases say, I listened to this podcast and learned this thing. And I think a lot of people see you as being, kind of one of the top people in exercise. And, it would surprise them to probably learn that you're still so hungry to learn and listen to all these different podcasts and things and change and open to changing your mind about things. And that's just really good to see. Yeah.
Yeah, I got to admit, it's not my nature. My nature is to be very religious and dogmatic about things. But to the extent that I have been in the past, is the extent to which I felt like it's been a limitation or limited my results in life. I mean, currently I'm reading Principles by Ray Dalio.
Oh, yeah. I mean to read that.
One of his big sayings is strong beliefs, but held loosely. And I'm trying to get to that place because, I mean, when you are presented with new evidence that contradicts what you have held dogmatically, particularly if you're someone that's written a book and now you've built this castle that you've got to defend the territory of, people quote things out of the book that I don't even remember writing. You really put yourself in a position of having to be very vigilant about unwinding a belief when you're presented with evidence to the contrary.
I love the way I wish I'd saved it for the podcast, but how is it you described it? It's like you're in a castle and you're pouring boiling hot oil over the sides at the invaders.
Yeah, I mean, just you've written and positions you've taken, you feel like you're standing on top of the castle pouring boiling oil on the people trying to climb over the top and topple you. So it's an odd mindset.
It's a weird thing, isn't it? Because it's like, I write a fair bit of content these days, and I obviously have recorded a lot of podcasts, and that's a lot of what I said on a podcast is like, it's like crystallized thought in time. It's the way I describe it. And it's like, I might not even think like that anymore. And sometimes you think, well, how useful is that to people if they're coming across views that I've changed, if they listen to, episode 2 in 5 years' time. But I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, though, because I kind of see the evolution, but it just stresses the importance of staying open-minded.
It does, and that's the tricky thing about writing articles or doing a podcast. It is sort of like psychic blockchain. What you've done is preserved forever in time, and then go back and say, look here, Lawrence said this back there, and now he's doing this, and what a flake. He can't even hold a thought. Rather than this guy's adjusted his thought process based on new evidence. I mean, what you have, like, fossilized in amber for everyone to look at. I wrote Ultimate Exercise Bulletin 1 back in 1998, and I mean, I still get shit about that, and there's been lots of revision on my thinking since then, but it's there in amber for anyone to look at and pull up a contradiction whenever I do an interview like this, so.
Yeah, that's nothing. Well, otherwise we don't take action at all if we worry about stuff like that, right? About us being wrong in 5 years' time or whatever.
It's hard. It's really, really hard because I was talking to Wendy about this earlier. It's hard to not give a shit about what people think because we are evolved out of the small hunter-gatherer tribes, and what other people think matters a freaking lot. Our entire survival depended upon our acceptance with others. When you post something up on Instagram and someone makes a critique, or Lawrence gets discussed over at Dr. Darden's board and one of those guys decides to take a dump on your physique, I mean, that shit gets in your head and it makes you crazy. And it's an incredible discipline to be able to tune that out and ignore it and just keep doing what you do. Because every time a post goes up or a podcast goes up, you're opening yourself up to slings and arrows, and we are just evolved to really pay attention to that. And we got to really use our higher cortex to defend against that. Our brain is constantly in battle with, brainstem versus cortex over that issue.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I see some of the things said about you and Body by Science, not personally about you, but more Body by Science. And it gets me so angry, and I have to check myself. I have to make sure I don't respond, out of anger, because it's just not productive. And I like what Tim Ferriss said about this. He said, quite often if you do respond to something, then there's the potential that there's going to be a lot more responses in the future, and it's going to be very, very time consuming and not very productive for either of you. So I kind of think about that before I get involved in something, but it's frustrating.
There's two possibilities there, and I always try to keep in mind, although it's extraordinarily hard to do, is that sometimes someone that rips you a new asshole online, it gets under your skin and niggles at you, but over time, you're like, oh, shit, they were right. I mean, you just kind of got to take it. And sometimes that's how you learn, and it's painful. Other times it's just, there are just some psychotic people out there that just, that's what they do. They just troll, and, that is just a discipline to be able to let it bounce off of you. And it just doesn't, but you get better at it, and you just do the best you can, it comes with the territory.
Yeah.
You got to feed the mosquitoes.
It's interesting hearing you, because you've obviously had more far bigger audience than me, and you've experienced that, and you're learning how better to deal with it, and that's very useful for me, for my journey. You mentioned just now blockchain. Just the thought occurred to me, I've got to ask you, even though it's totally unrelated to a lot of what we're talking about, what do you think about cryptocurrency at the moment?
Well, I think, in terms of its volatility at the moment, it's quite the shit show. And I think, if someone's using it as an investment vehicle, you should only be investing what you're willing to completely lose. But on a broader conceptual level, I'm just absolutely, totally psyched by it. Because here you have a currency that, by its programming, cannot be inflated by governments or people in power. You have a currency that an extremely poor person with a cell phone in sub-Saharan Africa can do business with someone in Europe and have a medium of exchange for doing that doesn't depend on a currency in their country that has been, exponentially inflated by some third world dictator. Third thing is that the fact that it is a blockchain where everything is fossilized in amber for all time has huge implications for contract law and for contracts without having to have, in air quotes, trusted third parties, which are probably the most untrustworthy people you could imagine. Mm-hmm. So it creates a situation where inflation and censorship will become impossible and obsolete. And the implications for human freedom are astounding. How we're going to make the transition from a fiat currency to a online cryptocurrency is in question. But right now, I think the only thing that's making the dollar a benchmark currency for the rest of the world is a collective willingness for everyone to admire the emperor's clothes. And once the domino effect of someone pointing out that the emperor is naked takes effect, I think there's going to be a quick transition to peoples and governments relying on a cryptocurrency. And I think it is going to be the future. I just wish I was smart enough to exploit it to get rich.
I agree with you completely on both, in both ways, in terms of your view on investing in cryptocurrency, and then also it conceptually.
Yeah.
Are you invested at all?
No, not currently. I came very close to doing it, and I still haven't. And it's mostly because, number one, from a tech standpoint, I just really suck. I'm like not a tech guy at all. And two is that when everything kind of started getting hot and I signed up for Richard Nicolay's Patreon account where he's tracking all of his cryptocurrency purchases and putting up articles trying to get more educated on it, all of that kind of took effect during the most psychotically busy period of emergency medicine and the holidays and all this other stuff going on, where it's just like, I just did not have the mental space for it. I mean, one of the biggest problems with doing emergency medicine is I can actually attest to you that decision fatigue is a real thing. I get home and I can't make the simplest of decisions. It drives Wendy mad. And literally, you have a certain number of decisions you can make during a day, and those get tapped out in an ER shift. And, it takes some time to recover enough decision nuggets to even contemplate things like that. And it just so happened that the timing of all this was not good for writing that bubble up. So. And it's probably good for me because I probably would have bought high and sold low. So, but I do think it's something that I'm going to continue to investigate and probably try to take a dive into at some point.
Yeah, that makes the rest of us feel a lot better knowing that someone like you is really affected by decision fatigue and has those shortcomings, because the rest of us do too.
Well, yeah. That's the thing to understand is it's not that there are people out there that don't suffer from decision fatigue. That is just a human cognitive fact. I don't care if you're Elon Musk. If you don't triage what your decisions are going to be, if you waste your limited number of decisions on bullshit, you're not going to have anything left over to make a big decision with. And a lot of times that's my problem, because the biggest thing I would warn people away from, and this is by my own mistake, emergency medicine, to a lot of extent, is a big mistake for doing other things outside of emergency medicine in the world that you might want to do, because a lot of your decision-making nuggets get consumed on just nonsense. And, deciding whether or not to intubate someone and put them on the ventilator, or whether or not someone can have a Tylenol when a nurse comes up and asks you, those, in terms of decision nuggets, are weighted equally in your brain. You've just consumed two of them. So a lot of, when you make yourself a captive audience to people asking you to make decisions, many of which are not meaningful, your decision-making capacity just gets wasted. And it's not like there's a special person out there that has more decision-making nuggets than another. It's just that you have to be very good at defending against wasting the number of decision nuggets you have in a 24-hour period on nonsense. And that's a discipline.
Yeah, I completely agree. And do you, to that end, do you automate morning routines and things like that? Because I know that was something that you weren't that interested in before.
There's two ways to answer that question. Is in an ideal world, do I have a morning routine? Yes. In the world that I live in, it's variable because my schedule is so variable. So tomorrow I work 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. in the ER. Then I'll have a few days off. And then the next shift will be 5 p.m. to 2 a.m. And then the next shift will be 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. And then you sleep during the day. And then the next day you're back to 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. And then the next day is a 2 to 11 p.m. So having a morning ritual when you're, staggering awake at 1 or 2 in the afternoon, it's just like, that doesn't fit. But to some extent I do, but it's not anything that's really that meaningful. If in the ideal world, I like to get up early and I like to get up before kids are up. And in that case, first thing I do is I hit the coffee machine, get some coffee. And then I try to avoid the temptation to open up any email or social media, try to sit down and have, a short meditative practice, then hit the journal. And then once I'm fully awake and everything cooking, then go into other things. And that's the most ideal thing. But the true answer is that gets applied maybe 60, 70% of the time, which is pretty damn good.
It is.
But a lot of times it falls apart just because it has to.
I understand. Final question on cryptocurrency is, I have limited knowledge, as I think everyone does. I feel like, a lot of these different currencies are hype. It's what will emerge is most of them will go poof, and one or two will be Facebook. And that's my feeling. And I think a lot of people are making a lot of money in the short term, managing it during a kind of volatile time. But then they are at risk of losing a large amount of money in the future, based on the way it looks currently. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think to invest in cryptocurrency probably is almost like being a venture capitalist. I mean, you take a number of bets knowing that 5 out of 6 of them are going to go to zero, but one of them is going to blow up so big that it will offset the losses in the others. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the only way, at least currently, to approach it. But then a lot of those sort of things are just a matter of luck and timing. Look, Arthur Jones, back in the early 80s, said TV is going to become something completely different. The 3 big networks is going to be done. He says, you're going to have TV channels built entirely around hobbies. And this was unheard of at the time. We're going to have TV channels, and it's all going to be how-to stuff. There'll be TV channels on how to cook. There'll be TV channels on cooking desserts. There'll be TV channels on cooking this. There'll be TV channels on woodworking. There'll be TV channels on home repair. And everyone's like, oh, brother, what a bunch of crap. And he built this gigantic TV studio. And he started recording all these different shows in all these different interest areas. Flying, home building, woodworking, exercise. All these different interests on all these different channels. Because the VCR technology was just coming out. But he built his entire empire on recording on beta. But he was 20 years ahead of his time, and the beta technology was clearly better back then. And that's what he banked on. And it turned out not to be what took off. And, it all went poof. But he was just 20 years ahead of his time. So it's just a matter of luck and timing. And sometimes, I love listening to the Tim Ferriss podcast, but sometimes I listen to guys that really act like they have a lot of wisdom to offer, but really fail to acknowledge that to a large extent they just got really damn lucky. And that's a big, big part of it. But the message never to be lost in there is that you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So sometimes life is just a matter of, throwing dog shit at the screen door and hoping something lands on the other side. You just got to get out there and mix it up. And it's the act of mixing it up that puts opportunity in your way.
I think that would be the quote of the episode.
Yeah, the thing before the podcast starts. That's
right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Wendy will love
that. Because that applies to everything we're talking about, right? Yeah. Exercise as well. Yeah. Okay, cool. Let's move on to some other things. Okay, time's ticking along, so I just want to make sure I cover some of the key questions here. As you might know, Doug, having listened to a lot of the show, I've really become quite interested in the zero carb diet movement, and this kind of, all meat carnivory approach to eating. I'm not one to do that myself completely. I do still eat things like potatoes and rice and vegetables and junk food on occasion. But I do eat a lot more steak than I ever have. And probably for the last 6 months, I've averaged maybe 1 or 2 steaks a day. And I was just curious, what are your thoughts about that in terms of a movement? And do you believe that's a healthy way of living? What do you think about that?
I think it's a great way to eat. I think it's perfectly fine, particularly for someone that finds that it works really well for them. And, if you think religion and politics is a place where you can get in a real scrap, bring up diet, and then you're off to the races, which is why I tend to stay away from it so much. But I think the more important thing is you have to look at diet in terms of signaling in your body, in particular hormonal signaling. And does your body, from an evolutionary standpoint, know what to do with the signals that you're inputting? And my gross heuristic for trying to deal with that is what goes into your body should follow a straight line between you and the sun. So that means being in the sun, converting vitamin D3, and who knows what other unknown nutrients are converted simply by being in sunlight. Then there's plants and phytoplankton that through photosynthesis convert sunlight energy into food energy. You can eat those. But the energy and the nutrients are not very concentrated at that level. And then along comes some fish and animals that eat those things. Well, you can eat those animals that ate the plants and the phytoplankton. And then you get all those nutrients, and the nutrients are being concentrated as they move up the food chain. And then there's animals that ate those animals, and you can eat those. And then there's animals that ate those animals that ate those animals, and you can eat those. And the higher up the food chain you go, the more concentrated the nutrients are becoming. I mean, you think about eating an egg yolk. I mean, what you're eating gets turned into a freaking chicken, for Christ's sake. I mean, that's a lot of stuff in there, a lot of which we don't even know and haven't even identified, and we can't put into a meal bar. So from that standpoint, I think a lot of people find great success with a carnivore type diet. I met a fellow in Iceland that's been doing that and has had astounding results from it in terms of body composition change. And I think the reason it's so profoundly effective for so many people is it takes you from someone that has been receiving all these extraneous inputs that confound your body's signaling architecture, and then take something that is highly purified and highly concentrated in terms of nutrients and signaling, and you have stripped away all of those extraneous signals so that your body knows what to do with what you're inputting. It doesn't mean that it has necessarily something to do with the macronutrient ratio. The fact that it's really low carb and really high protein and fat, depending on what you're eating, probably has less to do with the fact that it's been purified by a natural process of nutrient concentration that has stripped away extraneous signaling that is present when you process food. So it's just created a hormonal signaling environment that is optimized for what the body can do. Does that mean that, if you introduce carbs of some form, that it would all fall apart? As long as you stayed in a straight line between you and the sun, my answer would be no. Which is why you have a lot of people that go vegan, and if they do it in a natural way that stays in a straight line between them and the sun, they have outstanding results. Just as much as you have someone that's a pure carnivore, as long as they're on that straight pathway and they're not bringing in confounding signals, you're probably going to do pretty damn good. But my personal feeling about it is I think it's an absolutely fine and healthy way to eat. Over time, all things can kind of have some diminishing returns, but that doesn't mean that it would take very minimal tweaking to overcome any diminishing marginal utility of that approach. So if it's working well for someone in terms of their health, their well-being, their body composition, their sleep quality, fill in the blank, then who's to argue with that? Now, if you said, I've constructed my diet out of whey protein bars and I'm eating, X grams of protein per day, I'd be like, it's probably not the best thing in the world. But doing it the way I've seen people do it, I think it's fantastic.
And just for completeness, I always liked your analogy about the straight line from you to the sun. And obviously, the more processed and refined and food is, the more it kind of deviates off that line. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the more you're introducing into the metabolic machinery something that it may not know what to do with, or something that sends an energy signaling that's way out of proportion to what it should be. So we've gotten so attuned over the years to think of energy balance just in terms of calories or heat energy. But a lot of, the mTOR pathway, the AMPK pathway, all these different metabolic pathways, they're nutrient sensing. So if you eat, a small bag of Chips Ahoy, it may not be that it's that many calories or that much of an energy impact, but in terms of nutrient signaling, in terms of the amount of carbohydrate that's being signaled by a relatively small amount of food input, it's greatly disproportionate, and the signaling of energy intake relative to the amount of food you actually intake is so disparate that it creates, inappropriate biological signaling pathways. So if you have that high of an energy signal, even though you didn't eat that much, everything's going to be geared up towards fat storage when it's not appropriate to be storing energy.
And now it's time for a quick break. Join me this year on the 9th and 10th of March 2018 at the Resistance Exercise Conference, the science and application of strength training for health and human performance. We are going to be joined by some amazing speakers, including Robert Morton, a researcher and PhD candidate at McMaster University. Rob is the lead author on two of the most important and relevant papers published in resistance training in the last 5 years. His research primarily surrounds skeletal muscle adaptations in response to resistance exercise and protein supplementation. Though his focus is now mechanistic, he carries the unique ability to bridge the gap between the science and the practice. At the event, you will learn from the top strength training researchers, connect with exercise professionals from all over the world. You'll get a workout from an expert trainer and get inspired, rejuvenated and focused on your strength training business. You'll get the chance to chat with guys like Dr. James Fisher, Luke Carlson and Jim Flanagan. I will be in attendance with many of the Corporate Warrior listeners, and I'd love to meet you in person. To get 10% off your entry fee and $50 off your stay at the Graduate Hotel, which is normally $160 per night, head on over to resistanceexerciseconference.com and enter the coupon code CorporateWarrior10 in PayPal. This opportunity is only available for the next 5 days, so don't miss out on this great deal and take advantage before it expires on the 9th of February 2018. Head on over to resistanceexerciseconference.com, get 10% off your entry and $50 off your hotel stay by using Corporate Warrior 10 in PayPal. And now back to the show. But where that comes up, I guess, against a lot of criticism is, at the end of the day, fat loss is determined by calories in, calories out. In terms of, fat loss is stimulated by a calorie deficit. Yeah. And my understanding is that, looking at the example you just gave, that actually, it's that type of habit is going to drive bad behavior. It's going to drive overconsumption of food in order to try and get nutrients and protein and things like that. It's not, but in isolation, it's not actually going to cause you to necessarily get fat. Or am I incorrect? Or is it both?
It's a little bit of both. You're not incorrect, okay? Because in the end, if we're talking about fat loss, in the end, it's math. It is caloric accounting. It is, but the preconditions upon which you set that up can determine your success at creating that deficit or not. In my case, for instance, intermittent fasting and having a fixed feeding window makes it much easier for me to calculate a caloric deficit than it is if I spread it out over the entire day, just because the signaling is different and the discipline's different.
Yeah, totally.
You can lose body fat going to no place but McDonald's, as long as you calculate up, the cost of your Big Mac and your McFlurry and your fries and make sure it fits within a caloric deficit. Yeah, you'll lose body fat. But you will, in that case, both be in a caloric deficit and undernourished. Whereas what you're doing, you can lose body fat by being at a caloric deficit and being way more than adequately nourished. And when there starts to be a disconnect between energy signaling and your level of micronutrients is when that makes that approach as a long-term process untenable.
Why is that just due to adherence?
Yeah, because all the biological signaling pathways are in conflict with each other. Mm-hmm. If you have a micronutrient deficiency and you're eating foods that aren't nutrient dense, you're going to be driven to eat until you meet that micronutrient need. Mm-hmm. Which means if you're eating something that's not nutrient dense, you're going to have to eat a freaking ton of calories to meet that micronutrient need. So can you go on a 12-week diet exclusively of McDonald's and lose body fat? Yes. Can you do it longer than that without the whole thing falling apart? No.
Did you hear about Gary doing that? Gary Knight?
Yeah.
Yeah, is that why you're bringing up that example? Yeah. That's
right.
And
there's lots that have proved that point along the way, and you can. Mm-hmm. But over time, you got to acknowledge it's not going to work out well on the long term. You know?
Yeah, I mean, he obviously understands that. But
it kind of freaks me out too. I mean, Bo Rayleigh of Exercise Inc. in Indianapolis, in his office has a Happy Meal sitting on the shelf that's probably 20 years old. It looks like you could eat it right now. And that just kind of, it may not be anything bad at all with that, but that just kind of freaks me out. It's like, I don't want to eat that.
That's hilarious. Oh man, that's brilliant. I didn't know that. Yeah, no, that is very interesting, and it makes a lot of sense what you're saying. I mean, when I moved to Ireland, as you might have known, listening to the podcast, I started doing intermittent fasting, which became easier by eating larger, more nutrient dense food because I didn't have the cravings to eat. And obviously it's very easy for me to achieve maintenance or calorie deficit. And as a result of that, I got very lean, but didn't seem to lose any muscle mass. I do wonder though, this does lead me on. You've talked before about, excessive calorie eating to gain mass is like pushing with a rope. You're just likely to get fat and, it's not likely to have a benefit. Do you still kind of take the view of, well, maybe calories matter a little bit when it comes to optimizing gains, but if you are going to consume a surplus, that it has to be marginal. Otherwise, you're just going to get fat.
And very marginal. And I think I personally think it's a big mistake to really try to push the process on the nutritional side, the whole GOMAD, gallon of milk a day and all this hyperconsumption stuff. I mean, I think more and more, particularly the research that's been done recently on time-restricted feeding and circadian cycles by people like Sachin Panda, I think what's becoming evident is when you do that, you are just literally smothering your mitochondria. You're just pouring energy input into the mitochondria so aggressively from both the carbohydrate and the fat direction that you're just literally smothering it with waste product to the extent that it cannot function. I think one of the things that I wrote in Body by Science that I don't ever have to backpedal on, that I am very proud of, is that when me and John sat down to try to brainstorm a definition of health, we basically broke it down into, number one, an absence of disease, but number two was an appropriate balance between an anabolic and a catabolic state. And really, you cannot have an anabolic state without setting the stage for it with an offsetting catabolic state. There has to be an ebb and flow between energy input and energy output and expenditure. That's why there's an AMPK pathway, there's why there's an mTOR pathway, and you ebb and flow between these two things, and it's an absolute prerequisite for good health, and it's a prerequisite for muscle gain over time. You can't just have continual energy input and try to drive that process. I mean, you can do that, and part of a requirement for that to work would be, the inclusion of performance-enhancing drugs that just continuously and never-endingly pushes that mTOR pathway. But when you do that, you're dead before you're 50 because you don't have the appropriate ebb and flow there to achieve that goal in a healthful way.
Do you believe that a calorie surplus is even necessary to optimize muscle gain naturally?
I think it depends on who you are and at what stage of growth and development you're at. I think if you're a teenager to a man in your early to mid 20s, that it is beneficial and not necessarily a requirement, but it's probably a requirement for the production of the most rapid possible results. Later in life, when the hormonal environment is different, I don't think it's a very big necessity. And I know that when I was younger, I used to think it was impossible to lose body fat and gain muscle at the same time. And I may still believe that to some extent, but I believe that having recently lost some body fat, a significant amount of body fat, it set the stage for some new muscle gains. Because what we're starting to understand in the myokine research, which is where a lot of really beneficial research occurs for us in the training field, is research that's done outside any question of training. So what myokines have shown is that skeletal muscle and body fat are in this battle with each other. They're in competition with each other. Body fat is releasing cytokines that are highly inflammatory. Skeletal muscle is releasing cytokines or myokines that are highly anti-inflammatory. And to the extent that there is some excess body fat there, number one is it is getting a competitive advantage in terms of nutrient partitioning. And number two, the systemic inflammatory state that it can mount can actually impede and prevent the incorporation of new muscle tissue. So to some extent, Ellington Darden, way back in the 80s, or actually early 90s probably, when he wrote Upside Down Bodybuilding, actually hit the nail on the head as the first step in the process of trying to gain additional muscle is get as lean as possible. And then start building from there. This whole bulk phase thing, I think, is something that might work for someone that's in their teens to early 20s, but even then is not an optimal approach.
How lean should someone get with that in that regard?
In terms of health, you mean?
I guess I'd be interested in both health and then also setting the stage for optimizing gains.
Oh, for setting the stage for optimizing gains, I think you would just kind of have to look at the anthropological evidence of hunter-gatherers. And if you look at hunter-gatherers across the world, whether you're looking at, Eskimos or Hadza hunter-gatherers, most males, you're looking at somewhere between 9 and 11% body fat as being where they live. So that's probably the realm where you're going to gain optimal muscle mass, would be my guess. And what you're looking at when you're looking at someone that has that percentage of body fat is there is a diminishing marginal utility to carrying stored energy. So you can carry 15 pounds of body fat, and each pound of the body fat is going to have 3,500 calories of stored energy in it. And that has some utility in a starvation event. But if you have to, there's an energy cost to carrying around that 15 extra pounds also. So over time, if the starvation event only happens once every 9 months, but you got to carry that extra 15 pounds around with you for 9 months, the energy cost of doing that is higher than the benefit of having that 15 pounds. So the organism auto-regulates towards the level of body fat that's optimal for survival, but doesn't have the expense of carrying it around so much. Gypsies travel light for a reason. So when you look at hunter-gatherers, they're somewhere in that realm, 9 to 11% for a male. I'm not sure what it would be for a female. And I think that's probably what's more optimal. If you go lower than that for aesthetic purposes, I think you're going to have, depending on how you do it, and surely how most people do it, for their Instagram photo, you're going to have a loss of performance, a loss of functional ability, a loss of libido when you start to get down into the 5%, 4% range. If you're going to enter a fitness competition or a bodybuilding competition, to get that low with all the markers of health still being intact is a real challenge.
I've got a question here from a listener. They were interested to know if you've lost, 100 pounds plus of body fat. A lot of those people find themselves in a position where they still have stubborn abdominal fat that they're trying to lose, and then obviously lose skin as well. Do you have any thoughts on how one can lose that last bit of fat and then also maybe improve the appearance of things like loose skin?
That's tough because, when you talk to someone that's been morbidly obese and they've lost a lot of fat, but they still have considerable fat to lose, it's much more difficult for them simply because, fat cells multiply not only in terms of increasing their size, but in terms of hyperplasia and having more of them. So it gets harder and harder to empty those depots over time. And also over time, you have kind of beat down metabolic dog trails in the backyard of your body that are much more deeply ingrained towards storing and holding on to body fat. So it's just much more challenging and much more of a gradual process. If it took them 2 years to lose that 100 pounds, you're probably looking at 3 to 5 years of persistent, disciplined effort to get rid of that residual. Loose skin, I'm hardly the one to offer any advice on that at my age, but is much more a matter of your age and your genetics in terms of your elasticity of the elastin and collagen in your skin. Some people that have been morbidly obese, you're just going to have a huge amount of redundant skin that is only removable through a surgical procedure. If they were truly 350, 400 pound people that are now 190 pounds, you're probably going to need some skin excision to get that gone. Got
it. Cool. Okay, so a few minutes left. Just wanted to ask you a couple final questions. In fact, I want to make sure I touch on this one, so this will take the precedent. We talked a little bit before we started recording about, we've bounced around this episode so much, about, relationships with women and how perhaps a lot of men, don't necessarily see the process of obtaining a partner in the right kind of way. Did you want to elaborate on that, and then we can kind of see where it goes?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the dating realm and how to survive in it, I'm probably not a good advisor. I mean, me and Wendy met when we were 17 and 19, and we married when we were 22 and 20. So, I've not been out in but I listen to a lot of stuff going on out there in that realm, or a lot of discussion in that realm, and have to chuckle about some of it because I think it ignores some of our evolutionary biology. And I'd recommend anyone, to read Matt Ridley's stuff. And we got to do a book list before we shut this thing off too. So some of the things I would recommend people read, but Matt Ridley's Red will definitely kind of put a lot of this in perspective for you. But I think that, if you're really serious about finding someone that's going to be your lifelong partner, soulmate, wife, spouse, fill in the blank, I think it's much more important that you just be pursuing your values in life, whatever they may be, and being as productive as you possibly can, and then letting the finding of that person happen as a side effect or a consequence of that. And the reason that works is because of the biology of the situation. So when we think about, ultimately we are rental cars for the DNA that's in our body. That our DNA is only using us to carry it forward in time. And the selection of a mate or a spouse is driven by that process. So there's a supply and demand equation that's going on there. When you think about your significant other, girlfriend, wife, in the week before she starts her period and the week of her period, the amount of misery that can accompany that is significant for her and for whoever's around her. And through that agonizing process, she delivers one precious packet of genetic information every 28 days. You, Lawrence, can go in the shower and jerk off and deliver 40 million packets of identical information and wash it down the drain and not think a thing about it. So in terms of supply and demand of your equal contribution to the genetic production of offspring, which your DNA is demanding that you do to move itself forward in time, her packet is much more precious and much more valuable than yours in a supply and demand equation. So they have the upper hand. And their investment in those offspring by biologic consequences is much, much greater than the males. So her selectivity about who she is going to potentially share these packets, these precious packets of genetic information with, is much, much higher. So they have the upper hand, and they biologically have the capability of determining who they're going to give the time of day to and who they're not. And a lot of that's determined on a subconscious level, probably by smell, through human leukocyte antigens, which signal biochemical compatibility between people. So a lot of times you think you're walking into a situation and you're going to use your game theory and, really, manipulate the situation to your favor. And she's already decided by you subconsciously on smell as you walked in the door before you even aware that she was there. I mean, it's already said and done. And the thing that makes males valuable in this biological environment is one of the things that makes us valuable is that we have the ability to provide and defend, and we're expendable. Okay? And young males will always signal that expendability. The guys that have the hot chicks are, the extreme athletes. Formula One drivers are always surrounded by beautiful women because 6 of them die in a season. If you're signaling your expendability and your willingness to go there, that has a pretty profound biological impact. But in a more civilized society, the way that you do that is by pursuing your values and pursuing your goals and succeeding at them without consideration for anything other than the fact that, you're trying to do well in the world. And when you are intermingling with what it is that you value and you're pursuing it aggressively, then you're going to put yourself in the place of the type of people that you want to make a life partner. And it just happens serendipitously and organically. And I think that's the bigger message rather than, trying to go to some dating site and, figure out a way to have game. Or I think the other thing is this notion that you can go on an online dating site and through a questionnaire find compatibility with someone. You may have compatibility on a dating questionnaire, but your human leukocyte antigens may say, oh my God, anyone but this person. It's way deeper and more mysterious, and that's why there are all these songs through the ages about how opposites attract. So, anyway.
Can you elaborate on the expendability piece? I still don't quite get how that would make someone attractive to a woman, potentially.
Well, I think it just acknowledges your willingness to put yourself in danger to protect her and the offspring.
Right.
Okay, it is as old as human history. Women and children first. When the Titanic sunk, women and children first onto the lifeboats. Women and children first. Because it obeys the biologic imperative of DNA moving itself forward into the future. Any man that puts himself before women and children is not viewed by any female as a man or someone that's a worthy mate. I remember I was reading Robert Heinlein talked about being a young boy. He's a science fiction writer. Talked about being a young boy and was in a park with a a railroad trestle going across the park. And he said it was very upset. A young man and his new wife were walking across, and the wife got her foot hung in the railroad ties, and a train was coming. And the husband was over there trying to get her free from the railroad trestle because it was clear as the train came around the corner, it would not be able to stop, you know. And he said he saw a bum in the park rush up and try to help the husband of this woman get her foot free. And they were both struggling with getting her foot free. And he watched until the train hit all three of them and killed all three of them.
Jesus.
And he looked at that and he says, you know, that's forever burned in my memory, he says, because that is how a man lives and that's how a man dies. And that has profound biologic implications. There's many different ways to signal that. But that's what I mean by men are expendable. And it starts with who delivers what genetic packet and how, but it's also on a much broader scale. We're in a position, and, you know, despite all of women's liberation and modern, social mores, those biologic facts still exist. And your willingness to provide, procreate, protect, and defend are a lot of what defined you as a man on a subconscious level to a female.
That's profound.
So, and, you know, it is, but it isn't either, you know, and I mean, it's the reason that, you know, even if your significant other is a power CEO that makes 10 times as much money as you, for you, chivalry should not be dead. I mean, you should still do all the things that signal that fact, that what they have is precious and valued, and what you have is valuable and expendable. And the signaling of that expendability has value. Your willingness to go out and face danger, your willingness to take the bullet, your willingness to stand, to put yourself between, you know, your child and the attacking dog, or, you know, fill in the blank. It's just a very basic biological fact that can't be avoided, in my opinion.
Food for thought. You mentioned you wanted to list the books that we mentioned in this. Ones that come to mind are Nassim Taleb's work, which I'm ashamed to say I'm yet to dive into. And before you have a go at me for that, Gary also had a go at me for that. So I will be reading some of that stuff myself. Do you want to just list out the books that come to mind?
For sure, hit the Black Swan, because I think that probably kind of encapsulate Nassim's thought process on random events fairly well. It kind of leaves you feeling like, you know, what in the hell do I do with that? But I think in the end, it kind of harkens back to what we do and why we have such an interest in physical training. And that basically is adaptability and, you know, preparation and being anti-fragile. I think that's an immense benefit. In terms of how to incorporate all of the stuff that we're interested in terms of training in a way that defends against dogmatism, I would say one of the best books ever written is The True Believer by Eric Hoffer. So I have a copy of The True Believer that was given to Ken Hutchins by Arthur Jones. And then I got it from Ken to me. So it's very good. But the book basically describes the psychology of mass movements and how they occur. And it's particularly cogent today in the face of, you know, ISIS and, you know, the sort of religious dogmatism that's going on in the world and the type of violence that breeds. But it's also when Arthur Jones gave it to Ken had finished reading the book, and he went to Arthur and says, "This is a great book I finished reading." And Arthur looked at him, poked his finger on his chest, says, "How do you like yourself now?" And when you read that book, it will really, really make you squirm, because you realize the ways in which you are a true believer and the personality defects that exist in you that make you a true believer. And it also exposes to you the ways in which people can exploit you to make you a true believer. So that's kind of an interesting read in that way. And Eric Hoffer is a fascinating character. He was actually had an accident as a child that made him blind. But he suddenly, and for unexplained reasons, regained his sight at age 18.
All right.
And he just became determined to read everything that he could. He just got a public library card, and he was determined to remain poor. He became a migrant worker and became a dockhand, and aspired to go no higher than that because it would interfere with his studying. And very fascinating characters, and I think that's worthwhile. So Eric Hoffer. Economics, I think, is a super valuable topic for anyone interested in physical training, because economics really is a description of physical law and physical reality. And the ways in which that applies to your physical training will surprise you. One of the quickest and easiest introductions is Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, Hazlitt. Is a great, it's like mind-blowing. It will be like, I never thought about economics in such a basic way. In a more complex way, and it took me 3 years to read the book, but Human Action by Ludwig von Mises is astounding. And the best way is if you get that book, is just take it, lay it on the table, and drop it and let it open to any random page. And blindly take your finger and drop it down onto any sentence and read that sentence. And I don't care where you land in that book, in what sentence you land on, you read that sentence and you'll be like, wow, that is profound. And the whole book is probably, it's probably 1,000 pages long. It's gigantic. But the whole book is nothing but any sentence you put your finger on is so profound, it will just absolutely blow your mind. So, Human Action by Ludwig von Mises. The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand was really good. And it's really good in a way I didn't expect. There's a protagonist that is Howard Rourke. He's an architect that operates from complete rationality and from first principles. And then there's an antagonist or an antithesis to him called Peter Keating, who's a complete second-hander. He looks completely to society for signaling about what should be done and tries to set himself up in a way where he can succeed within those constraints. And the book makes you really uncomfortable because as you go through it, you're like, oh shit, I'm more like Peter Keating than I am a Howard Rourke. But as you progress through the book, you start to understand that what this is saying is that we are all Peter Keating and we are all Howard Rourke. We are evolved to seek out approval and social signaling. And that's our brainstem. But then we also have our neocortex and our prefrontal cortex that's Howard Rourke. And we're always a mixture of the two. And it's not like you can be purely one or purely the other, but you got to learn when to apply one and when to apply other and when it matters. And it's an agonizing process to go through that book, but once you learn how to incorporate that, it has a lot more meaning for you. If anyone's got young, teenagers or young adults that are coming up, a self-published book, and I don't know if you can even still find it it's either John T. Reed, R-E-E-D, or Jack T. Reed, called Succeeding, is really an interesting read. It's very super duper pragmatic about just how to set up the odds in your favor for things working out well in your life. And that's from spouse selection to career selection to how to succeed in sports. Just basically, it's a very pragmatic tutorial on how to set yourself up to win. And I think it'd be particularly useful for a young person. So, but off the top of my head, that's just a few that I thought worthwhile mentioning.
I've never heard someone sell a reading list so well. I'm so intrigued. And because I get bombarded obviously by recommendations on every podcast, but also in between, I probably read less than 1%. And now I'm actually really, really intrigued, and I'm definitely going to read at least 2 or 3 of those.
And it's the stuff written by Arthur Jones. One thing that I found is a continual theme is that books that have had a really profound effect on me have turned out to be self-published. And I've learned through experience now going through commercial publishers that the editing process and the process of making a book readable for the public is a very homogenizing process that takes a lot of the really good stuff away. If you look at Body by Science versus the question and answer book, the question and answer book is basically everything that got out of Body by Science. Mm-hmm. But, when you read anything written by Arthur Jones, it was self-published. And it's a little raw and it's a little messy, but it's absolutely profound. Eric Hoffer's basically self-published and got picked up by a publisher. But it's really profound. When you read, and Jack Reed's stuff is self-published, but it's just chock full of good information that hasn't been homogenized and tarted up by, some 23-year-old editor that got a job at Random House or whatever. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I find those self-published books to be just so much more impactful than something that's really been turned into, a lot of the nonfiction and self-help books out there. When you get done reading them, you're kind of like, well, that was good, but shit, that could have just been a blog post.
Yeah.
It's really a blog post with an assload of anecdotal stories wrapped into it. And by the time you're done with it, you just want to pull your hair out.
Yeah, I totally agree. No, those are some excellent recommendations, and I agree. That's interesting what you say about the kind of publishing industry. I didn't realize that so much of the editing process can take away from the original.
It does. Not necessarily in terms of content. Sometimes they're doing a great service in terms of making it more pleasant and easier to read. Mm-hmm. But sometimes the soul of it just kind of gets lost in that. And that when that's still present there, even despite being a little bit more laborious or more grammatical errors, punctuation errors, I don't care about that. Just getting the purity of someone writing about something they're passionate about can be really a powerful experience.
Yeah. Doug, what is the best way for people to find out more about you and your work?
Currently, probably just to go to the website, Dr. McGuff. So that's Dr. McGuff, MCGUFF.com. Mm-hmm. There's links on there to, I do blog posting now with comments turned off on there occasionally. YouTube videos are linked through there, so they can pop up there. If people want to consult with me, I do consults on all breadth of topics from, your personal training program to, I want to start my own HIIT facility, I got this issue with training that's problematic for me. I got a health issue that's wrapped into a training question. How do I make training work for me in this context? I'll talk to you about anything.
You can also switch comments off on YouTube if you want to.
Yeah, I'm leaving that open for right now. As long as it doesn't get just totally hijacked by trolls like old, Body by Science blog post. That just went down the toilet, and I just did not have the time to try to police that at all. So I just gave up.
Yeah, that's fair enough. No, this has been so much fun, Doug. I always really appreciate you taking the time to come on. I learned so much, and this is one that I'm going to re-listen to multiple times. But yeah, thank you so much for taking the time. And for all the listeners, to find the show notes, resources, everything that Doug and I mentioned on this episode, please go to corporatewarrior.co/Doug. and that will redirect you to the blog post for this episode. And for all episodes, so a whole list of all podcast episodes, please go to corporatewarrior.org. And until next time, guys, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that episode. Before you head off, head on over to corpwarrior.com, that's CORP warrior.com, to get your free high-intensity training Google Progress chart and ebook with 6 interview transcripts of some of my top guests, including Dr. Doug McGuff, Drew Bay, and Bill Day Simone, on how to optimize muscle gain, fat loss, and overall health in an efficient, effective, and sustainable way. These transcripts are deliberately not verbatim. Instead, they've been transcribed in an easy read format to make it more enjoyable and easier for you to quickly pick out what you need and start getting results. To get your ebook, head on over to corpwarrior.com, enter your email address, then check your email for an email from me with a confirmation link. Once you click the link, you will be instantly redirected to a PDF version of the transcripts. This episode is brought to you by the Resistance Exercise Conference, the science and application of strength training for health and human performance. Would you like to learn from the top strength training researchers, network and connect with other exercise professionals from all over the world, join a welcome reception on a Friday night to build relationships with other strength training professionals, experience an early morning workout from an expert trainer to kickstart your Saturday, and get inspired, rejuvenated, and focused on your strength training business? I certainly do, and that is why I am attending and interviewing all of the speakers at the event. The Resistance Exercise Conference will be held on the 9th and 10th of March 2018 in Minneapolis, Minnesota at the Commons Hotel. To get 10% off your entry fee, head on over to resistanceexerciseconference.com, click the registration button, and enter Corporate Warrior 10 in the promo code field in PayPal. I'm very excited about this, and I've wanted to attend for years. Sign up now at resistanceexerciseconference.com and get 10% off with promo code Corporate Warrior 10, and I look forward to meeting you in person.